Well, good morning, Emmaus. Good to see you. Always loving these weeks of the scripture reading beforehand, causing questions in your minds. Like, what are we talking about? A couple of gnarly stories. We have more gnarly ones to come. Anyways, want to just simply say to you, welcome to Emmaus. We're really glad you're here. If we haven't met, my name's Matt. I'm one of the pastors here. And I want to just really quick affirm you as a church and just say, well done in stepping into the needs that were raised by Fowler Middle School, just to step in and engage with a local school and say we care. You guys have also put together more than 150 care packages for those who are experiencing housing insecurity this winter. And honestly, I just want to affirm that you're being the church, which is an incredible thing. It's to say that you have stepped into this way of embodying the gospel, that the good news of Jesus, the announcement of his kingdom, is always something that comes embodied in person through people. And the gospel isn't this kind of message dropped from heaven. It's actually always embodied, first through Jesus and then through his spirit-filled people, always. And so thank you for being that reality this Advent season. I want to just encourage you that way. And so it is Advent. This is the second week of Advent, a season that celebrates the arrival of God in the flesh, the thing the theologians call the incarnation, God incarnating, taking on flesh, humanity, onto himself, and coming in person through Jesus. And so as we celebrate Advent this year, we're looking at a series that we're calling Mothers of Jesus, where we're looking at the four named women in Matthew's genealogy, in Matthew chapter 1. Tamar, and then Rahab today. Tamar, last week, we looked at her story. It was a story of breakthrough. And today, we look at the story of Rahab, someone who is truly an outsider in every respect to the Jewish storyline of the Hebrew Bible, and yet she typifies the way in which God makes outsiders insiders, the way of God's open acceptance to sinners. And so let's look at her story this morning as we work through these moms of Jesus, if you will, these figures throughout the Old Testament scriptures that point to us to the reality of Christ and who he is and what he's come to do. So if you have a Bible, turn it to Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2. We'll just begin in verse 1 here. It says this, "And Joshua, the son of Nun," N-U-N, not like he was a son of no one, the son of Nun, sent two men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, "Go, view the land, especially Jericho." All right, let me just quick pause and give some context to what's happening here in the storyline. Particularly if you're new to the Bible, this might seem a little strange. The storyline up to this point is that God has made a promise to a character named Abraham. And that promise was that this childless old man would have children who would become nations and who would have a particular offspring who would bless and redeem the nations. And he would have a land. He's a landless wanderer, and God says, you'll have a land, a home. And if you rewind the story back to Genesis chapter 15, there's this moment where Abraham is wrestling with Yahweh, God, and saying, here's the deal. I think that I'm going to die, and my inheritance will go to one of my servants. And God says, no, not so. Look up. Look at the stars. Your offspring will be more numerous than the stars. And then he also says, look around. This land I will give to you. But not yet. You're going to wander for a while. You're going to wander in a tent. This is going to be your home, but you won't get to build on it. In a sense. And so someday, in fact, all of your family will be slaves in another land. And then after 400 years, I will set them free, deliver them, and bring them back to this land. And so this, of course, sets some of the stage for this whole spiritual journey motif that you get throughout the Bible, that the reality of God's saving work is like here now and not yet. That there's life with God is a life in tension between what's been realized and what's still just promised. And In fact, even Emmaus as a church name has come from a story in Luke 24 that is about a traveling pair of companions. They're on the way, and they meet Jesus on the way, and they're sent on the way. And so Israel's story is one where they've been promised a land to be at home within, where God will dwell in their midst, and yet God says to Abraham back in chapter 15, not yet. Not yet. You can't have the land yet, because, he says, the sin of the inhabitants there, the Canaanites, is not yet complete. That's an interesting thought. So there's something here to God's story that's saying, look, Israel, I'm giving you this land as a grace gift. You didn't earn it. You don't deserve it. But that grace gift also doubles as a judgment on the nations who live there, because they continue to act in a pervasively evil manner, in a way that's morally reprehensible and won't turn toward what's right and just. In fact, you can go read Leviticus 18, where it describes the practices of the inhabitants of that land as being morally corrupt, or Deuteronomy 12, where it talks about the way they would offer their children as sacrifices. And so there's this picture that the Bible is building that this is an issue of idolatry and injustice, and God is allowing evil to reach its kind of climax before he moves his people in and these people out. And so God, after his mighty deed of rescuing the people from slavery in Egypt, moves the people towards the land, and Joshua now takes over as leader in place of Moses. He replaces Moses, and he's this kind of military-type leader who had once been a spy himself. In fact, do you remember this story? When Moses sent spies into the land, and they all came back, and 10 said, that's a scary place, let's go back to slavery in Egypt. And 2 said, no, God's giving us this good and spacious land. Well, Joshua was one of those spies. And now he's saying, in obedience to God, we're going to go into the land that he's commanded us to take, and that he's given us as an inheritance. This is ours now by the grace gift of God. And he sends in spies to check out the strongest military installation on the way in, which is Jericho. And so they went, the spies, it says, went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. They chose what was likely an inn, somewhere that was like one part hostel, one part brothel, something like that, somewhere that they would get a chance to have some discretion. It's on the outskirts of the city, on the wall, not somewhere that they would be noticed all the way through the city. And so it's a good choice for discretion, and also probably a good place to get information, because who else has more dirt on everyone in the city than this lady? Because she knows what's up, right? I'm imagining she's heard a lot of stories, a lot of talking. And so, by the way, nothing in the text implies that these Israelite spies were doing anything improper, but this is where they go. Interesting, right? Grace is found in surprising places. And it was told to the king of Jericho, the narrator tells us, behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land. Word still got out, even though they were, maybe they just weren't good spies. I don't know. But think about that for a second. Like, guys, you're spying. Don't get found out. Anyways, word gets to the king. The king of Jericho sent to Rahab now. He knows exactly where to go, saying, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land. Now, if you haven't heard this story before, imagine hearing it audibly for the first time, because most of the scriptures, at least in Israel, were heard audibly. When people knew the scriptures, they knew them from hearing them. And so imagine hearing the story and the suspense is building, right? What's going to happen? The suspense builds. Word got out to the highest authority in the land that there are spies and they're searching out the land. And so the king confronts Rahab. Bring out these guys. Bring them out. Now, imagine for a second you're in Rahab's shoes. Imagine you're not exactly a person of high repute. You're kind of on a bottom rung of society. The author's careful to not designate her as a temple prostitute, which is somebody who would have had a little bit higher esteem in the sense of her vocation would be connected to the worship of the local gods. But no, she's just someone who trades sex for money. And so she might have some motivation to distinguish herself at this point. I mean, you have the king. Would you have ever spoken to the king before? Probably not. And here he is. And he needs something from you. And you have it. And it's not the thing that everybody else has been looking for. This is a way to distinguish yourself. Imagine being in her shoes for a second and thinking, I could really step up here. And yet, what is she going to do? It's a moment where her loyalty to the king and the local gods could be shown by betraying these spies. What's she going to do? What's she going to do? Here's what the narrator tells us. The woman had taken the two men and hidden them. Okay, interesting choice. And then she said, true, yes, king. The men did come to me, but I did not know where they were from. I didn't know they were spies. And when the gate was about to be closed at dark, the men went out. I don't know where the men went. Pursue them quickly. You better get to it, for you will overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hid them with stalks of flax, and she had laid out in order on the roof. And so the men pursued after them on the way to the Jordan River as far as the fords. And the gate was shut as soon as the pursuers had gone out. Notice this double emphasis. She hid them, and again, she hid them. Now we're learning what's going on a little bit in her. She's certainly not being loyal to the king, not loyal to the gods of Jericho. She's strangely being loyal now to these new strangers. And the question is, it first starts out like she hid them, and will it work? Will she be found out? Will they inspect their home and find the spies? And it turns out her plan works, and we learn how. She hid them really well on the roof. She put time and attention into this. She did a good job. However, the author tells us now that the gate is shut. Again, the suspense builds. They're shut in the city. Can they get out? What's going to happen? And so what we find is two Israelite spies completely vulnerable and at the mercy of this person, Rahab. They're in utter dependence upon her. What will she do? What will become of them? The vulnerability of the spies is an occasion to see what's also happening in Rahab spiritually. Here's what we read. Before the men lay down, she came up to them on the roof, and she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and the fear of you has fallen on all of us, and all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who are beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, and whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left of any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath. What is she doing? She's describing something and she's confessing something. She makes a description and a confession. Here's the description. She describes the state of the people in the land before this story. So we're terrified. We're afraid because we understand that your God is more powerful. We've heard the story of the Exodus. We've heard the story of the way he redeemed you. And the greatest superpower in the world had just come to nothing under the judgment of God. Right? You imagine that for a second. Egypt was the superpower. They had all the economic wealth. They had the military supremacy in the land. And yet their gods didn't stack up for a second to Yahweh. But then, more importantly, she makes a confession. Not just a description of how people are feeling, but a confession of what she believes. She says, for the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the land below. This is an incredible confession, by the way, from a Canaanite prostitute in a fortified city of Jericho. She's saying this, that her local gods don't actually have the jurisdiction over the land. Even though they purport to be in charge, they're not in charge at all. she's saying, look, our superpower of a fortress is nothing compared to the power of your God. And the God of Israel, she says, runs the cosmos. He's God in the heavens. He has the real authority over the land. He's God of the land too. In other words, she's saying, your God, the God of Israel, is the supreme God, which means he displaces all the rest. Now, that's quite a claim. That's quite a claim. It's a claim that Israel's God, redeeming them from Egypt and judging the gods of Egypt and the nations now, has completely melted her. She's melted before this God. She's not going to pretend that her former views are somehow worth preserving. Instead, they all melt away. Of course, leads to a question for me of what would melt in me if I could grasp the supremacy of Christ over all things? What anxieties would melt today if I could behold Christ as the one who's supreme over all? What arrogance might melt if I could see that Christ is supreme above all? What bitterness would melt if I could see Christ's supremacy above all? She's showing that she's melting here. All of the former allegiances have melted away now, and she is ready for an allegiance to God. And in place of her old ways, she makes a move that we have to learn how to make. Her claims about God lead her to make this move. Look at what she does. Verse 12. And then she says, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and my mother and brothers and sisters and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. And then the men said to her, our life for yours, even to death. If you do not tell this business of ours, then when the Lord gives us the land, we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. She has not just been kind, by the way. The Hebrew word for deal kindly is a word that we get throughout the Hebrew Bible as a description of God. It's you have to say it with a lugi. It's chesed. Okay, it's hesed. It means loyalty. It means steadfast love. Oftentimes is what it gets translated to in the English Bible. This steadfast love, the covenant loyalty of God, that he keeps his word in relationship to people he's in covenant with. I have been loyal. Will you be loyal to me, saving my people? Well, what's Rahab doing at this point? Well, she's deciding to be loyal, not to a morally corrupt culture or to short-term gain to the power brokers of the city, but she's being loyal now to Israel's God, which, by the way, is a decision of faith, of trust. She's only heard the reputation of what this God's done, and yet she has prepared him room, and she's ready to trust this God. This is the kind of thing that we saw Abraham choose when God called him to leave his family and go to a land he would show him. He gave up the gods of his family, and he went with Yahweh. We'll see it next week in Ruth, that she also shows this hesed love, this covenant loyalty to her mother-in-law who has nothing to offer her. But most of all, this chesed love of God is a family trait for God's people. It's a family trait they're meant to have, this calling to be faithful to this covenant relationship with God, to be loyal to him, forsaking all others. And that is to be a family trait of God's people because it is a family trait of God himself. This is the way God acts towards people. When God describes his own character in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6 and 7, he goes before Moses and he says, I'm going to reveal my glory. And then the way he reveals glory is to describe his character. And he says, I'm Yahweh, a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger. You can make him mad, you just have to work really hard at it. And abounding, he says, in chesed. Right? I'm abounding in chesed and emet. Steadfast love and faithfulness. what the spies promised to give her. If you don't tell the business about us being here, you'll receive from us steadfast love and faithfulness. That's exactly love and truth. It's amazing. And then he's the God who also forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin, and maintains justice. This is, by the way, the most repeated verse in the Bible, by the Bible. The Bible repeats this one verse on itself. It riffs on this verse more than any other verse throughout the Psalms and the prophets. Over and over and over it is referenced because it is God's description of his own character. And he has this steadfast love, this hesed love. And so she doesn't just have an existential crisis. She isn't just looking for moral reform. She's not just having a spiritual experience. She is choosing to be in a relationship with the God of Israel, in a covenant relationship. And that now has social implications for her. It means that she will be loyal to God and his people. And that is pretty astounding. And so she says, this loyalty I've given, now please make sure I'm given the same. But not just, in other words, don't just save me. Save everyone who takes refuge with me. And they say, absolutely. This is an important and often overlooked dimension to this feature of the Bible story where Joshua and Israel comes into the land of Canaan. It's often referred to as the conquest. And the truth was, it wasn't an all-out slaughter, that's hyperbolic language that Deuteronomy it sometimes uses. But most of all, we see people like Rahab have an opportunity to turn toward Yahweh. That all throughout the land, people have an opportunity to turn toward the God of Israel. And so there's always choice and agency for these tribes who had been wicked for centuries to turn and accept God's grace. And so people from the Canaanite tribes could turn toward Yahweh and become part of the covenant community of Israel. And that's exactly what's happening in Rahab's story. And the narrator describes her as loyal, and so she sets the spies down out of the wall through a window with a rope, lets them escape. And the spies promise her that if she ties a scarlet cord in that window, her and all who take shelter in her household will be spared. In fact, if anything happened to her or her family, the guilt of her blood would be on their heads. In other words, they're entering into a covenant relationship with her, and they're saying, we'll be guilty if anything happens to you. It's also interesting that she lives in the wall, and it's the walls of Jericho that fall, and yet she's saved. And so it's quite interesting that the place of grace for her and rescue is exactly in the place of judgment as well. And so here is Rahab, this person who is really a hero of faith, a non-Jew, female, from a morally corrupt vocation, in a morally corrupt city, and she is summarized by the New Testament in Hebrews 11 as a hero of faith. This is what Hebrews says. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down when they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute Rahab did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Interesting. The prophet Ezekiel talks about Sodom and Gomorrah, those two cities in the Old Testament that were like burned by fire. When he describes the sin of Sodom and the sin of Gomorrah, Ezekiel says it's inhospitality. And yet here is Rahab, the hospitable one, the true Gentile, the one who has made space for God and his kingdom. James describes Rahab when he describes the insufficiency of a faith that has no pairing with work. If your faith is just by itself, you just give verbal assent, but there's nothing in your life that shows for it. He says this, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. What he's saying is he's talking about a faith that works. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so faith apart from works is dead. And so James as well looks at Rahab and says, that's an example of faith. That is somebody who trusts God, and as a result, obeys. It's amazing, the story of Rahab. She's a nobody, really. In fact, she's worse than a nobody. Again, she's this compromised, morally ethnic outsider to the promises and covenant of Israel. And yet, she's someone who also belonged to a city that fell under extreme judgment and had made a reputation for herself that, of course, wasn't positive. I mean, think about perhaps what it was like to be her for a second. She's carrying some things around. She was, of course, the other woman to a great deal of wives in Jericho. And yet, she is the mother of Jesus. She is someone God uses as a vehicle for redemption. All of her family is saved through her faith. And we learn as well from the end of this narrative section that Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out the land. She becomes a part of the family. There are, of course, children in Israel who know her as Auntie Rahab, right? And go over to her house and learn the stories of what it was like to live without Yahweh and what it's like now to live under grace. I mean, this is really astounding. What do we learn from her story? One of the ways that the Hebrew Bible makes a point out of a narrative, one of the ways, is the way a character's name plays out in the events of a story. Rahab's name means open. Wide open is what her name means, literally. And so while she had previously been open in a way that probably brought shame, now we find that, in fact, she's open in a way that brings honor and redemption. She's a named mother of Jesus, an exemplar of faith in the New Testament. She is the ultimate Gentile, non-Jew believer, someone who is exemplary in being open to the living God. Her openness offers a roadmap for other people to follow in her steps of loyal trust in the living God. So how do we respond in a way that follows Rahab's putting faith into action, a way that follows her friendly welcome to the advent of God? Just a couple things for you this morning. First of all, I would suggest that Rahab simply made space for the reality of God, that you and I can follow her path by making space for God, the reality of God. She could have kept the status quo. She could have even been rewarded for keeping the status quo. But she lived with an astounding openness to the living God, which led to a risk of everything. Because she ultimately trusted in the reality of the God who was coming, bringing both judgment and salvation. The question for us, is there space for God in my life? Is he crowded out by screens? Is he crowded out by my schedule? Is he crowded out by things I want to keep in place as walls against his sovereignty? They're not very good shields, of course. God can bring down the walls of Jericho. He can also bring down the walls we put up as well. And so it's much better to follow Rahab's example of being open. Being open. Am I open? It's interesting as well, by the way, that in the last 50 to 100 years, it has been the religious folks who are considered closed-minded, and perhaps many of them have been. But the irony, of course, is that it is far more closed-minded to go on saying there's no such thing as a spiritual reality that supersedes everything. It's a far more closed-off perspective. The reason is that such a small-minded claim is that it's really putting oneself in the place of supremacy, right? And I would suggest that a common cold is enough to put us in our place in the cosmos. Have you ever noticed that? How quickly you're ready to plead for the mercy of God because your nose won't stop leaking? I could just get my life in order if you could just make this cough go away. Like there's something that happens in our vulnerability that reminds us of our place in the cosmos. And I would suggest today that we need to be reminded that we are not ultimate. And Rahab was quick and open to accept that. And so Rahab says, there is a God among the Israelites who does mighty deeds, and he rescues them, and he brings ruin. And she's open. She sees the presence of God coming not as her ruin, but as her rescue. And she runs toward him. Is that your life today? Would you see the coming of God in Christ and the Advent as your rescue? He has not come to ruin you, but to rescue you through Christ. So run toward him openly. She made space as well by echoing God's judgment of empty gods. Her rescue of the spies equally meant that she was not on board anymore with the corruption of her city. She was done. And she probably knew its corruption better than anyone, and its emptiness better than anyone. And we must grasp that we also have idols just as much as the ancients did. We call them different names, and we offer different liturgies of worship, but many gods still exist. There are empty gods everywhere. Stroll through Washington Square Mall this Christmas season and observe the countless deities and countless liturgies offered, where anxiety is attempted to be quelled by the offer of debt to appease the gods of consumerism and the gods of appearance and of course, having more and giving more cool stuff. This is just a small example, but the reality is that making space for God for Rahab meant that he was the one God. Making space for God meant that he didn't become added to a pantheon of other deities, a shopping mall of deities. Rather, his coming meant a showdown, and that showdown meant the other gods of her life had to go away. And she was ready for that to happen. And therefore, her hospitality to the spies was an agreement with God's judgment on the rest of the city, on the spiritual system of Jericho, to say this is going nowhere. So her hesed, loyalty, was also an abandonment of Jericho's small g gods. And then, this is the reality, by the way, that when we live the gospel, it's good news to some, it's rescue for some, and it seems like ruin to others. For we are the aroma of Christ, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 2, to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To one, a fragrance from death to death, to the other, a fragrance from life to life. And she says, I see death and I want to run from it. And I agree that these empty gods need to go. Also, she made space for God's kingdom and reign by aiding his mission and staying with his people. I think this is really an important point here. That what I mean here is the advent of God coming in her life is the same for the advent of God coming in our life. It springs you into action. And so she aids God's mission by aiding his people. She's an example of faith that works, according to James. And so she springs into action, which very much looks like giving herself, putting herself on the line for something bigger than herself. There's a commitment here. She commits all the way. She recognizes that it could cost her, but it would cost her more not to aid the spies, because the arrival of God's kingdom was a mission worth aiding. And of course, Joshua 6 summarizes that she remained with God's people, so she has a new community. She moves towards new community and towards new mission. Last week, Jay encouraged us all to think through our own resources from a place of gratitude and said, let's consider what God has given so that we might be prepared and prepare our hearts to think through how can we give of ourselves. And so we have been thinking through this next year and longing again to prepare for planting more churches down the road, for global mission, for pouring more energy into outreach through local partners, as well as more ministry to the body here. And so how does that happen? Well, that happens when God's people say, I want God's mission to be my mission. When people say, I'm going to make space for God and I'm going to aid the mission with my time, like set up some chairs and, I'm going to go help out with kids or whatever, with my energy, with my resources, and because I, like Rahab, long to see the arrival of God's kingdom, right? I aid the mission and stay with God's people. And then here's the final thing this morning. Final thing this morning is this. She made space for God ultimately by taking refuge in God. You make space for a tyrant perhaps by being ready to work slavishly for them. You make space for a God of pleasure by planning a year's worth of parties, I don't know. But you make space for a gracious God by seeking him as a refuge. And that's what she does. She doesn't prepare a spiritual resume. You notice that? She doesn't say, hey, look at all the things I've done right. She doesn't make a defense or a justification of her life. She simply shows covenant loyalty, anticipating covenant loyalty by grace. Her wide open stance to Israel's spies echoes God's wide open acceptance of people like Rahab who would find him as a refuge. This is really the crux of the message today. She was not seeing God as a threat, but as a hiding place. That it was finally here in the God who was coming through Israel that she could have acceptance and belong. She didn't perish with the rest of the city. In fact, she was saved by faith, like everyone else in God's family. Saved by faith. She was rescued by God, who would be a refuge to anyone else who would hide in him with her. How can he do that? How can he do that? The spies said, you know what? We'll trade our lives for yours. And this, of course, anticipates the one who did trade his life for ours. How can God treat Rahab graciously? How can he treat you and I graciously? We who don't have a clean bill, who sing of God's salvation and recognize that he alone has rescued us from sin. How do we sing with joy? Because we understand the one who came through Rahab eventually. She would have a great grandson who would one night have another woman in her line of work prepare him for burial, who would weep at his feet, pouring out perfume, recognizing it was through his coming death that she would be rescued. A woman who wept tears of being accepted over the one who had come to die in her place, an offering for sin once for all. See, Jericho would have its walls torn down by the hand of God, but Jesus Christ came and was torn down as well, losing his life in our place, bearing the judgment of God so we could find him to be a refuge. And that's really the way to make space for God this season. It's to find him as a refuge, to trust in him as a refuge. I don't know where you're at today. Spiritually, I don't know if you're living with a list of a resume and defenses for why you should be accepted, but let me encourage you today that the only place to find freedom is through the one who is a refuge by grace. No argument can be made on your behalf except his infinite grace and his ultimate pleasure to be a refuge for all who trust in him, in his hesed love shown in the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Let's pray. God, we come now to the table to celebrate the way in which you have become a refuge for us. God, may we be like Rahab, the one who is not reduced to the way she had been used, but ultimately the one who is elevated as the one to follow and the one to be like, open to your coming, open to your mission and your people, open, Lord, ultimately by taking refuge in you, the God who has come to save the weak, the powerless, the ones who keep getting it wrong and keep finding ourselves having to say, I'm so sorry. We keep finding ourselves saying, God, I need your grace and your help today. So we come to the table as equals here, and we come to your table ready to receive and proclaim here in the body and blood of Christ is our great refuge. This is God come among us. Lord, we love you. We celebrate your coming. Thank you for being our rescue. In Christ's name.